All right, everybody, welcome to our class on this Super Bowl Sunday. It's close enough to being a holiday in America that we might as well just acknowledge it for what it is. Okay, so today we are going to pick up what we were discussing last week, which is taking a look at the commandment not to murder. And we took a look at the, first of all, at the idea that despite what some of the older translations say, the translation "do not kill" is probably inadequate. And to some extent, though, the translation "do not murder" is also somewhat inadequate. The most accurate, probably, way to describe it in fairly simple terms is "do not kill illegally or without against in violation of the law." And we looked at some examples where that wasn't necessarily a violation of the law. The most notable one is when God would order the Israelites to go to war or to take vengeance upon a people, or in the case of the Canaanites more broadly, to kill or displace them from the land as they entered into the land. That was under God's command, and when God tells you to do something, you don't have to worry about the legality of it because He is the definition of what righteousness means, and so the problem is solved. We also looked at the avenger of blood, both in the context of someone who's justified in killing himself because he's killing in vengeance or in punishment for the murder, for a pre-existing killing, or in the case of someone who accidentally kills or kills without malice. And the two kind of distinctions between those is the one is the situation where a completely or fundamentally unforeseen event causes someone's death. The example I used from, I forget if it's 1st or 2nd Kings, where the man is using an axe to cut a tree down and the axe head flies off and hits one of his fellow Israelites in the head and kills him. That's about as unintentional as it gets, unless you were just completely reckless with taking care of your axe and making sure that it was working properly. It's pretty much as accidental as it gets. The other one that we see, though, in there is where someone does something on purpose but not intending to harm. You're playing around, you push somebody, he falls down, hits his head, and dies. If there's no malice there, that the scriptures say that's not murder, that's not killing unlawfully, that's just an accident that went, a situation that went wrong. And so those are the situations where someone would flee to a city of refuge, perhaps being pursued by the manslayer, and if they were able to make it to the city of refuge, and the congregation judged them to not have been killing in unlawfully, but rather either accidentally or negligently, I guess would be the term we would use, then they would have to stay in the city of refuge until the death of the current high priest, however long that might be. Which, as I said last week, is an interesting thing because in a very real way what you're saying is we're going to let God decide how long this person's punishment should be. Because God is the one who decides how long people live. And so if the high priest is a young man or a relatively young man who just entered the office, you're going to be there for a long time. And if the high priest is an elderly man who's on his way out, you may be there for a few months depending on the situation. And so in a way, what the Israelites are doing there is they're saying, okay, if we have a murder, we take care of it. We execute the person who murdered. And if the congregation judges that it was murder and not accidental or negligent or whatever, then the appropriate remedy is putting them to death. And so just because you made it to the city of refuge doesn't mean you're scot-free. You have to go through a trial, and if you are judged guilty, then the result is that the congregation then executes you. It's no longer the hands solely of the avenger of blood. It's now everybody's job to actually do that. Because if you call on everybody for justice, then everybody has to deliver justice if the conclusion is that you're guilty. So then you have that collective responsibility for that. But otherwise, you have the situation where the person just has to wait until the death of the high priest, and then they can go home after that. So, okay, with that in mind, then let's kind of move on. Actually, before I move on to the next one, I think we covered everything that the comments people wanted to make last week, but we went a little overtime and we had to stop. So let me make sure there's nothing to add to what we've talked about up to this point. With the understanding that what we're going into now is the idea of witnesses. So we'll talk about the need for witnesses next. So if that's what you want to talk about, just give it a second. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on then to Numbers chapter 35. Numbers chapter 35 establishes a very important principle, which is the idea that you need witnesses. And so in Numbers 35, God says, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall not take ransom. Actually, let's stop there because then we're getting into a different issue here. So, one witness is not enough. You need at least 2 witnesses for someone to be put to death. Okay, now, is this different from the avenger of blood situation?
Yeah. Not when the trial comes up.
Okay, so, but that's an important distinction. You actually just made a distinction for us. This applies if you're having a congregational trial. It does not necessarily apply to the avenger of blood. The avenger of blood is not necessarily limited here or elsewhere in Jewish law to having to have 2 witnesses before they can act. Their job is to act, and if you can't get to the city of refuge, see here again, and this is a thing that we have to step away from our Western way of looking at things for a minute here to understand this. We think in terms of the process and the rule of law as being fundamental to the legitimacy of the process. In other words, if you don't have a trial and it doesn't follow the rules, then the result is illegitimate. Even if you got the right result, the result is illegitimate because you don't really know how the result was achieved. That is the fundamental principle of Western law. And it's a reasonable principle because you can't, if you don't follow the process and you don't have some sort of divine intervention, you can't be sure that you're coming up with the right results. And we have way too many examples throughout our history of when people decided to take the law into their own hands and it went really, really wrong, or they got it really, really wrong. And so we believe, or at least lawyers believe, because we have to, but we believe that the process has to be followed for the result to be legitimate. Even if you were to get the right result, it needs to be followed so that it can be legitimate. But you need to realize that the Israelite mentality begins with the principle that nothing happens that God doesn't want to have happen. In fact, you can almost take it a step further and say nothing happens without God making it happen. That would be the Israelite mentality. But certainly at a minimum, nothing happens without God allowing it to happen. So from the viewpoint of the Israelites, if someone killed someone else, and you don't know whether it's murder or it's whatever, and the avenger of blood catches them before they make it to a city of refuge, then what does that mean?
God wanted it.
God wanted it, exactly. So it didn't happen because the avenger of blood was faster or smarter or stronger, or the other guy was bad at running or whatever else it was. It happened because that's how God wanted it to happen. And so you don't need a trial because remember, a lot of this, we talked yesterday or last week about some of the aspects of this where it kind of looks like trial by combat. And that's the same idea with trial by combat, is that idea that the stronger isn't the one who's going to prevail, it's the one who's righteous that's going to prevail. And in this context, the belief of the Israelites would be that the result of the race between the person who killed and the avenger of blood, if the person who's trying to get away doesn't get away, it's because God didn't want him to. And so you don't have to have a trial because the problem has been solved. God has rendered his judgment. And his judgment is better than human judgment anyway. You only have to have a trial, you only need witnesses if he makes it to the city of refuge, because now you're not sure what the situation is, because the scripture said you're not sure. The congregation has to judge at that point. So remember, and we're going to talk about this in the sermon, ironically, here again, one of those kind of weird overlapping things. There's a passage where it says, vengeance is mine, I will avenge. God says that. So when things happen that take care of the problem, you don't have to go judge it. You don't have to try to figure out if you've got the right witnesses and you've got the right evidence. In the county attorney's office, one of the things we would run into every once in a while, when I spent most of my time there in the main office prosecuting vehicular felonies, aggravated DUIs, assault cases involving injury caused by automobiles, and even a couple of manslaughter cases involving an automobile where someone had been killed. And the astonishing regularity that we found was that the person who was drunk oftentimes came away from the accident with the least injuries of anybody. And the joke, is always because they went limp or whatever it is, but whatever the reason is, the simple fact is that with astonishing regularity, when something really bad happens involving somebody who's drunk, it's usually the other people that seem to get hurt more often. But occasionally we would have a situation where somebody was drunk and they would run into, say, the divider between the highways, those big old posts. They'd lose control, slam in that thing and kill themselves. Or they would, go flip off the road and roll over and over in a fiery crash. And we called that self-adjudication. And that was because we didn't have to try those cases. We didn't have to prosecute them for, drunk driving or anything else. They took care of the problem for us, or God did, or fate did, or whatever you want to credit for that. The process has been taken care of. And you don't have to have a trial, you don't have to do anything. And the avenger of blood was viewed as being part of God's justice program, as weird as that sounds. And that's why there were such strict rules about it, though. And this would be, imagine, you have geared yourself up to the avenger of blood. You chase after this guy. You maybe came within minutes of catching them before they get to the city of refuge. And now the congregation comes back and says, yeah, they're not a murderer. You got to deal with that. You got to shut down that impulse. I've got to kill them. You've got to go back home, and you've got to let them come back home when the time is right, because you're no longer authorized to kill them. And that's kind of a big thing. But there again, it's built around the idea that this is God's justice program and not man's justice program. Okay, Ian.
So my question is, from a legal standpoint, what if the Avenger of Blood has the wrong guy? Right? There's no pictures. There's no right. We don't have the FBI's most wanted list at hand here. So he's on the trail, and then he gets on another trail and finds the wrong guy. Right? What's the process there if the Avenger of Blood is wrong?
So if the Avenger of Blood were to have killed someone who was not the person who he was supposed to kill, he would be guilty of murder as well, because there was an intentional killing that he didn't have the lawful right to do.
But then does he admit that and have his own trial, or?
Well, that would be an interesting situation. He's going to start running.
Do you see what I'm saying?
But under the principles of the law, if his defense to the congregation were, I was chasing after this guy and I got mixed up and I killed this guy instead, generally speaking, that would not be considered a justification. You've got to be right if you're going to be the Avenger of Blood. And here's the thing. Remember our premise. The Avenger of Blood is part of God's justice system. So if the Avenger of Blood kills the wrong person, then that means that somehow they were doing something that was contrary to what God wanted. Mm-hmm. So even if the Avenger of Blood doesn't admit that he was doing something contrary to what God wanted, the assumption would be he must have been doing something contrary to what God wanted, because otherwise this couldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. Now, from our perspective, the Western perspective, that is reasoning from the conclusion to find your facts. And that is not how we do things, but that is not how the Jews reason. The Jews reason from the assumption that everything that happened was what God wanted to have happen, and therefore, if it doesn't happen the way God would want it to happen, it must be sin. Sin is diverting the flow away from what God wants into something that you want, okay? So I've got Linda first, and then I'll go to Jerry.
I just finished the first 6 books of the Old Testament.
All right.
It seemed to me that the Avenger of Blood was a family member of the victim,
Yes.
typically.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so the Avenger of Blood has a very similar job to the kinsman redeemer, which is a concept we come across in Ruth. In Ruth, the kinsman redeemer is the closest male relative to a male who dies, whose job then is to step into his role, marry the widow, and have offspring through her that will continue the bloodline of the one who died, while also continuing his own bloodline. And so it's interesting. I find it interesting. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little off topic here, but it's fascinating to me that at the same time, more likely than not, the same person is the guy whose job it is to produce life and to continue a bloodline and to end life and end a bloodline, if that's what the situation calls it. And it's one of those kind of interesting dichotomies of the law that we see. You could you could even conceivably have a situation where somebody killed the husband of the person who was your brother, and so you have to run and kill them and then head back so you can sleep with the wife so you can keep kids going. So it's kind of a strange set of circumstances here, but yeah, it is always supposed to be the closest male relative. That's their job, and if you don't have any close male relative, the Jews developed, or the Israelites developed some principles for that. It's not specifically laid out in the law, but because of the way that bloodlines were established in Judaism, it was very unlikely to have someone who did not have at least somebody who was a relative, a male relative of some sort. It would be extraordinarily unlikely that would happen. Jerry?
We assume that God approves of this avenger of death because of this kind of thing. I mean, we've got no record where God says this is the way it's supposed to be done.
Yeah, it is. That's what we looked at back here. So the blood avenger should put the murderer to death. You should put him to death when he needs him.
I guess I've read that as that's already in place. Who is the blood avenger? Who do we know? I mean, have we got...
Do we have an example of this?
Pardon?
You mean, do we have an example of someone doing this?
We don't have any real, anything from God that talks about the blood avenger, except that he does exist.
There actually are some other passages that do talk about who the blood avenger is supposed to be. Other than this lays out their duties, the other passages talk about who it is that has the job.
Okay, all right, well, I
but-
understand that, it just seems to me that I guess I'm too much of the Western culture to understand the blood avenger.
Well, it is a concept, as I said, we struggle with it because it runs contrary to everything that all the principles that we apply about what justice should look like. It doesn't follow the procedural rules. We create procedural safeguards because we believe that the courts and the legal system are driven by men, and men are fallible, and therefore men can make the wrong decisions. And so we build that into our justice system as much as possible, and so we create as many procedural safeguards as we can, sometimes even more than I think probably we ought to, but not by much. I mean, I would rather be where we are right now than very far back from it, because very far back from it, you get some very, very bad results. And so it's that mindset that we have, and it's one that has developed. I mean, we've had, if you use the Magna Carta as the beginning point for Western democracies to start thinking in terms of everybody, or lots of people having rights, and the right to trial in particular, which is laid out by the Magna Carta for the first time in a document where it's laid out and it's fairly expansive. Now there's, the Romans had one and some of that, but the Romans, it was still a trial for an emperor who could render a unilateral and completely arbitrary verdict if the emperor chose to. So the Magna Carta is the first time that kind of lays out, okay, here's who gets the trial, here's when, and here's the rules for it. If you think about this, the Magna Carta is 1200, something like that? Something like that. So we're talking a little over 800 years. We have closing in on 1,000 years of history of how we do things. And on top of that, on the top of the Magna Carta has been layered procedure after procedure after rule after principle and everything else, until today we have, everybody has a right to a trial. Everybody's supposed to be, tried using the same rules and the same principles and everything else. And so we have lived with that, not just our entire lives, but our entire culture's existence. This country has never known a system that wasn't that system. Not under English law, anyway. Even under Spanish law, the Spaniards applied the same principles to themselves, not so much to the natives, but to themselves. We have never even, like I said, as a nation, as a people, we have never experienced that. And our history, when you think about it, going back to the Magna Carta, is as lengthy as the Jews going back to Abraham at the time, well, even longer than at the time that they were first receiving these laws. That was 450 years before that Abraham encountered God. So their history is even shorter at that time than our history that leads us to this point here. So it is not a natural thing for us to think in terms of when someone does something, that is in fact actually executing what God wants, even if there's no way to check with God if that's actually okay or not. And that is a deeply troubling idea for us, and I'm not suggesting for a second that what we should get out of this passage is that we should start doing this ourselves. That's not the point. The point is to understand what the difference is between an unlawful killing and a lawful killing, and a lawful killing. So, Steve.
It's interesting to me that Cain, the first murderer, or the first recorded murderer, basically gets off without the punishment. His punishment should have been death.
Right.
But it wasn't. Instead, God preserved him, marked him, so that others wouldn't. It's just interesting to me that he did not get punished.
And it's interesting to me as well that when God tells him what his punishment is going to be, which is, you're going to wander, you're not going to be accepted, you're going to be alone, his response is, my punishment is too great for me to bear. In other words, this is the worst thing you could have done to me. And yet death would seem like, that has always been viewed as the ultimate punishment. It's interesting too, though, to realize that it's not until Noah that we actually see God articulating the idea of, if you shed blood, man's blood, that your blood is going to be shed. Before that, it's not articulated. Now, that doesn't mean that God didn't say it, it just isn't written down, and it doesn't mean that people didn't understand it, because God certainly expects Cain to understand when he first talks to him, before he's told his brother, to understand that there's a danger here that he's going to do something really wrong. But it isn't actually expressly stated in the scriptures until Noah that human blood is, that human blood, the shedding of human blood results in the shedding of the murderer's blood. Sylvia?
But if you look back, I mean, God said tooth for tooth, an eye for eye, and it was kind of, you hurt somebody else, you get hurt the same way.
But he said that in the law of Moses, though. He didn't say that. I mean, what I'm saying is that when it comes to Cain, Cain's murder happened before there was any sort of, at least anything written in the scriptures to talk about a formalized rule. Now, there are a lot of things like that we could argue. We talked about this before, for example, with some of the stuff like the Sabbath stuff. Many of the Israelites and the culture that they were in were already practicing Sabbath rests. God establishes it as a rule, a law, but it was not something that he had to explain to them. Here's what a Sabbath is. Here's what it means to not, he had to tell them don't do any work, but it wasn't like they were shocked by that, which suggests that the notion of a Sabbath had existed long before it was ever written down for the first time. And it is likely that the notion that murder is something you shouldn't do is something that existed long before God told Noah, hey, innocent blood can't be shed. But with Cain, we don't really know for sure what the rules were that applied to him. But let's not forget that the first and fundamental rule was if you eat from the tree of the fruit of the good and evil, you'll die. And yet they didn't die when they ate from the tree. They died spiritually, and then they ultimately died physically at some point down the road. So the consequences of sin are always death, but it's not necessarily instantaneous until the law says that's what's supposed to happen. So it's complicated. But I do agree that it's interesting that the first example we have of somebody who murders, we don't see the response being, let's execute it, when it becomes the law that is the central to the law of Moses. So, yeah, it is an interesting situation. Okay, so let's go, I've jumped away here. So let's go back here. So you've got to have at least 2 witnesses for the congregation to make a judgment. Why not just one witness?
Vindictiveness.
Okay,
False testimony.
So there's the risk of false testimony. Now, technically, there's the risk of false testimony with 2 witnesses as well, but the more witnesses you have, the less likely it is that you have a bunch of people that have conspired together to provide false testimony. And so it's not... I don't know who the gentleman was. I don't recognize him, but he opened the door up, got one look, and went, nope, that's not where I'm supposed to be. Closed it back in. I'm guessing he was going to the AT&T store because he had them directly over there.
And Ryan, these witnesses couldn't be women either, right?
In practice, yes. It's never. I don't believe it's ever specifically articulated in the law, but in practice, yes, it had to be male witnesses. So we have a number of kind of issues here. With one witness, there are 2 big problems. The biggest one is that a person is lying or vindictive. You have a false witness for whatever reason. And the second reason is actually very close to that, which is that it's much easier for one person to be mistaken about something. One of the most disturbing things that we find when we do studies of firsthand recollection of events is that people overwhelmingly get things wrong. I mean, overwhelmingly. In law, the interesting thing as a prosecutor was that in general juries respond the best to first-hand witness testimony, and in general first-hand witness testimony is the most inaccurate testimony you could possibly present to a jury, which is a very weird dichotomy when you think about it. Juries think that when I hear from somebody who said I saw this or I experienced that or whatever, that unless they think they're lying, that this must be correct, that this must be accurate. And yet all that we have seen about how, and all the studies that we've done about how people remember things, what they perceive, all of that stuff says that people's memories are actually pretty bad, especially in times of stress. That we tend to get tunnel vision, we don't know what's going on around it, we tend to misidentify core facts. One of the most common ones, and this one is fascinating to me, is that after you see something or experience something happening, there is a very high possibility that if you hear enough about what happened, that you may alter your memories to actually line up with what you think happened. I forget what it's called, but it's an effect based around a television show, or a movie, I forget, where so many people believe that they'd seen this thing happen in the movie, but it didn't actually happen.
It's the
I know
Mandela effect.
And that's right. It was not. it was the Mandela effect. It was people thought he was dead, right?
Yeah,
Because
people had a memory that he was killed when he was in prison
right,
during apartheid, when in fact he didn't die until like 2017.
right, and he lived on and was involved in South African politics for a long time after that. In my world, the world of Star Wars, there was an action figure that was created between the first and second movie, the Boba Fett character. When they originally designed him, he had a rocket pack on his back that fired this little missile. It was spring powered, and it would shoot out. And the lawyers took one look at that and said, no, you can't send that out to a bunch of kids because they're gonna end up swallowing it and they're gonna die and stuff like that. Because there'd been another toy created just like 6 months before that had exactly that happen. So before they ever sent any of them out, they were still in the prototype phase when they did that. Before they'd ever sent anything out, but they'd advertised it that way, that it was going to be, actual shooting action. They never sent one out to anybody. The only people that have them at this point are people who are collectors who were able to get a hold of one of those prototypes. There's probably less than a dozen of them that exist. No one ever received one. And yet there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who believe that they received one of those in the mail. And they're not lying about it. They simply have recreated memories to fit in with what they think happened. And so witnesses are interesting because witnesses don't necessarily lie as often as they are mistaken. And you can see this the most easily by what happens if you put more than one witness on the stand and you ask them detailed questions about something. It is almost a certainty that if you put 3 or 4 witnesses on the stand that you are going to get slightly to substantially different versions of the events. And in fact, as a prosecutor, if I put 2 people on the stand and they said exactly the same thing, I knew they were lying. And especially if they used very similar words to describe it. And then I knew they had conspired to lie to me or to the court. And most juries actually, this is interesting, is most juries actually can recognize that too. If you put several witnesses on the stand and they say exactly the same thing, most juries start to think, these people are lying. They can't be this similar. Because all of us actually understand that we do remember things differently. That we do have different, that our experiences are the angle that we're seeing it from, perspectives on what should be happening, what shouldn't be happening. All these things influence the way that we experience and observe and understand what's happening around us. And that makes witnesses relatively unreliable. Now today we have a lot of ways of determining whether something has happened that step beyond what witnesses can do. And in particular we have forensics. The Israelites did not have forensics. I mean, the notion of most of the ways that we actually determine guilt would have been completely incomprehensible to them. But, so witnesses were the main thing that they had, and that's what you've got to use. But when you know it's unreliable, as I'm confident God does, He's building in some degree of buffer for the reality that witnesses can be unreliable by saying you got to have at least 2. We're not going to just take one person because, of not just intentional but also accidental bias. So I've got Sylvia and then I've got a bunch of people over here. But go ahead, Sylvia.
If you look at the 4 Gospels, people say, well, that contradicts. No, they don't. It's exactly that. There are 4 different people who look at
Right.
the same thing that happened, and everybody looks from their own point of view and sees it a little bit different.
Exactly. And that's something, that's something we don't like with the Gospels. We'd like them to all be exactly the same, but of course we have 4 of them if they were exactly the same. We would like them to exactly agree on the details where we can see that they're overlapping. But the truth is that when you've got 4 different people, 2 of whom aren't even there, who are working from either their own recollections or from recollections of other people, like Luke definitely did, you're not going to get exactly the same recollections of those events. And that doesn't mean it isn't inspired. It means that what's being inspired isn't the word-for-word recounting of it, it is the recollection of the spiritual truths that underlie the things that were happening and the overall description of what's going on. Mark, go ahead.
I was going to say, what would happen? Okay, you had 1 witness, but you only had 1 witness to a murder. And that witness is adamant. I mean, you hear somebody arguing, you're not seeing, but you see them. You see the guy kill the other person or vice versa, whatever. And then, the Avenger of Blood happens, the guy runs off, he goes to the thing. Now they're having this
Trial.
Yeah. But there's only 1 witness. And when that happens, what happens to the person? Then what do they say? Oh, we only got 1 witness, so he goes free?
Well, he has to stay in the city of refuge.
Right. But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop the Avenger from blood to wait for the guy until
it doesn't matter how reliable the witness would be, it doesn't matter how strong the testimony might be, none of that matters. It only matters that you have to have at least 2 witnesses. You can't do it without 2 witnesses. Now, that seems very arbitrary to us, because if we had 1 witness who definitively saw someone kill somebody else in cold blood, we wouldn't have any problem convicting them, assuming that that was a witness that the jury trusted. But again, what is our core principle about this whole process? What's the core principle? Who's in charge?
Innocent, oh God.
God's in charge. So if justice would have been for that person to be executed, then there would have been more than 1 witness there. See, this is the kind of logic that makes me nuts, because that's the opposite of the way lawyers are supposed to reason. But if God is in control, and God wanted that person convicted of murder, then there would have been more than 1 witness. Or the avenger of blood would have caught him. One of the 2. Now, that seems completely backwards to us. But that's the way that the Israelites would have approached it. Because that's the only way you can logically approach it. And let's also remember, our legal system has built into it a lot of protections for the defendant that go way beyond the protections that victims receive. And we've built more victim protections in recent years than we used to have before, and more victims' rights in. But nevertheless, our system in general is designed to err on the side of the defendant. Because we would, generally speaking, and not specific cases, but broadly speaking, we would rather have an occasional person go free who did commit a crime than to, as a society, be responsible for the execution or long imprisonment of someone who didn't commit a crime. One of those things as a society is, whoops, we missed. And the other one is, we as a society acted to deprive someone of their life or liberty, and we were wrong about it. And so we would rather have that happen. And we know that even still, it does happen sometimes. But this, in a way, is that same idea on a much more simple scale, which is, even God presumably would rather have justice done than arbitrarily get it right sometimes and not other times. And so even though the only 1 witness standard, the 2 or more witnesses standards could create a situation like you're describing, it would be better to have that than to run the risk that once somebody realizes, hey, if I'm a credible enough witness, I can get anybody executed. At the moment that thought goes through somebody's brain, the system is just all off its rails at that point. Linda.
I think you have to look at it in a historical perspective. I mean, the Israelites were 400 years with the Egyptians in enculturation. Then they were 40 years contentious in the wilderness with God. Now he's giving his commands and laws, and it's like truth and consequences and absolute right away. He's making an example so that people won't sin.
Right. Yes. But he's also going to have rules about how you make an example. That's the same thing.
But usually it's done quickly, not like today
Right.
It goes on.
No, that's one of the biggest elements. Is that there's supposed to be a quick resolution of this. Either the person is dead before they make it to the city of refuge, or once they get there, a trial should be held almost immediately. And in practice, it was held almost immediately.
And when the other people see it, they're more apt to toe the line.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the key idea when it comes to deterrence value of punishment is that there's 3 elements of it. It has to be swift, it has to be consistent, and it has to be significant enough to make somebody not want to do it. And in our country, we have rarely got the swift part down. We rarely have the consistent part down. And the thing we're the best at, but even still pretty bad at, is having some level of punishment that's severe enough to prevent people from wanting to do the crime. When you don't have any of those things, you don't have deterrence anymore. What's interesting is that there is one area of law in this country that we actually are very effective with deterrence in, and that is DUIs. DUIs used to be a massive problem back in the 70s and early 80s, and MAD, along with a bunch of different prosecution agencies and legislatures, created some very, very kind of bright line penalties and consequences. And because of the unique nature of how a DUI is investigated and prosecuted, which is that almost every DUI investigation is instigated by who? Who starts a DUI? In other words, a murder happens, the murder takes place, and then at some point law enforcement gets called out to come and investigate after the fact. But who starts a DUI investigation from the very beginning? Normally.
Police?
Yes, the police do. Because they're the ones that are driving around, they see somebody driving erratically or speeding or whatever, they pull them over and they begin an investigation. So from the very beginning, you have someone who is a professional witness. And I don't mean that in the sense that they get paid to testify. I mean that in the sense of that they have a unique set of training to observe and record their experiences, and they also have a set of standards of how to determine what they're seeing. So you have what are called field sobriety tests, but they are standardized field sobriety tests. Every single officer follows the exact same rules. And I'm betting that Mark could probably still give somebody in here a standardized field sobriety test after having done it all that the times that he had done, and it would be exactly the same field sobriety test that somebody in the Payson Police Department would do right now today, with the same exact instructions and the same set of circumstances and everything else. So it is designed to make sure that from the moment that somebody is encountered who might be drunk, the process is followed exactly. And somebody who knows how to observe and is making notes and is keeping track of everything is observing it. And so it's extremely difficult for a defense attorney to go into court and argue, it wasn't my client. Well, we have this guy who's probably got photographs of your guy. He's definitely got, he's looked at his license, he's done all this stuff. We can show it's your guy. Well, okay, maybe it was outside of the jurisdiction. Well, no, the police officer knows his jurisdiction. He's going to be able to testify to that. Well, maybe, maybe he didn't have a good reason to pull him over. Well, the officer's going to be able to testify. These are the things that he did before I pulled him over. And the law in every U.S. state is that if somebody violates a traffic law, no matter how small, the police officer has the legal authority to pull them over and to initiate at least a traffic stop, which they can use to then investigate and observe for symptoms of DUI. And so you go through this thing and go through this process, and if you're a defense attorney, fighting a DUI is one of those miserable things you can do, because the conviction rate at trial for DUIs is well over 90%. The plea rate is well over 98%, because nobody wants to go to trial. It's just going to cost you money. And so the thing with DUIs is, it usually is quick, because the courts try to dispose of them as fast as possible, and there's usually no reason to keep continuing them on and on, because the evidence was gathered by 2 or 3 people max, over the course of 2 or 3 hours max. And so everything is ready to go and it moves really quickly. The punishment is, generally speaking, set out by law, how much time you're going to spend in jail, how long your probation is going to be, all this different stuff, and it is very consistently applied. Most jurisdictions do their very best not to accord special favors to someone, not even police chiefs, not even famous movie stars, different things like that. There are a few places that aren't so good about that, but in general, they try their very best to be consistent about that. And what you see happening then over the course of 30 years is DUIs going down and down and down and down and down, until they finally have reached a point now where, while they still definitely occur and they are still definitely a problem, the number of deaths from DUIs in particular has gone down to just a tiny fraction of what it was before. Because in one situation, deterrence actually works when we apply all those principles. The rest of the time it doesn't. And so the law of Moses is definitely designed to follow the deterrence principles. It's got to happen fast, the punishments are severe, and they are consistently applied. It doesn't matter who you are, they're supposed to apply to you. So it definitely is set up to go that way. But here again, when you have a system that is that efficient, it also has to have safeguards to make sure it doesn't get wrong on a regular basis. So, okay, I had several hands up. Sylvia, were you going to say something?
No,
Okay, Ian.
Well, it might be a bit of a silly question, but the idea here of you get to the city of refuge and we're having a trial now, like it's a really quick deal. Is that perhaps the inspiration behind the 6th Amendment?
The right to a speedy trial? There's an element of that. The idea is that from either side, the longer you wait to have a trial, the more likely it is that witnesses are going to have problems with their memory, that evidence is going to be lost or destroyed, the further away you get from when something happened, the less reliable your outcome is.
Right.
And so the fear under the right to a speedy trial was that defendants might be prejudiced by this. And what was happening with Great Britain was that they would charge someone with something and they would hold them indefinitely. So they wouldn't actually try them, and they would turn that into a punishment. We don't actually have to have a trial. We don't have to prove anything. We can just hold you until we're done. Or they would transport them all the way back to England, which could be a several-month-long process, where they would be tried a very, very long way away from most of the witnesses and most of the evidence that actually was collected. So there was concerns about the risk of abuse the longer it went. So I don't know whether it's really directly related to the idea in the scriptures, but there is that idea, and this is an idea that's been around in English and American jurisprudence for a very long time. Justice delayed is justice denied. And that's true for both the defendant as well as victims and society as a whole. Okay. So, all right, anybody with a last question or comment before we break on this? And then next week we'll pick up the idea of taking a ransom and what that actually means. So, okay, well, let's take a break here. We got about 15 minutes and then we'll come back together for worship.